What if everything we've been told about global power is backwards? Is the West actually more dependent on Africa than we ever realized? Right now, something big is happening. African nations are starting to restrict exports of critical raw materials to Western countries, and for the first time in decades, the balance is shifting. The West is beginning to feel the pressure. So what's really going on? Who made the first move? And what does this mean for the future of global power? For years, Western economies have operated on one key assumption. Africa will always supply cheap raw materials. From oil and gold to uranium and lithium, Africa has quietly powered industries across Europe and North America, fueling everything from smartphones to electric cars. But that era is starting to crack. Across the continent, several African countries are stepping in with new rules, tightening control over exports, limiting the flow of raw resources, and pushing for more value to be created at home instead of shipped abroad. And this isn't just a policy change, it's a power move, because for decades, the system worked like this. Africa exports raw materials at low prices. Those materials are processed elsewhere, and then sold back at a much higher cost. The result? Africa stays rich in resources, but poor in value. Now, that cycle is being challenged. By deciding how their resources are used and who gets access, African nations are no longer playing a passive role in the global economy. They're rewriting the rules, and the world is paying attention. 1. Ghana's gold power move. Ghana, one of Africa's top gold producers, is making a bold shift in how it manages its natural wealth. Under new rules, mining companies are now required to sell 20% of their refined gold directly to the Bank of Ghana. This isn't just a minor policy tweak. It's a calculated strategy to strengthen the country's gold reserves and reduce its dependence on foreign currencies, which have historically exposed the economy to global financial shocks. By keeping more of its gold at home, Ghana is working toward greater economic control and long-term stability. For years, much of Ghana's gold left the country in raw form, only to be refined abroad, where most of the real value was captured by foreign companies. But that model is now being challenged. The new policy pushes mining firms to refine a portion of their gold within Ghana, ensuring more value stays inside the country. And this goes beyond economics. It's a direct challenge to a long-standing global system where African nations export raw resources while others reap the biggest rewards. Ghana is essentially asking, why should a country rich in gold rely on external currencies to stay economically stable? That question is at the core of this shift. For decades, Western industries, especially in jewelry and electronics, have benefited from relatively low-cost gold sourced from Ghana. Now, with tighter controls in place, that advantage is starting to shrink. As supply dynamics change, gold prices are rising, putting pressure on these industries through higher costs and reduced profit margins. Ghana's message is clear. The era of cheap, freely exported African resources is coming to an end. The country is taking back control, ensuring that its gold supports its own economic growth, rather than fueling prosperity elsewhere. 2. Uganda's agricultural shift. Uganda made a bold and transformative decision. It moved to restrict the export of raw agricultural products like coffee and tea. As one of the world's leading coffee producers, Uganda recognized a long-standing problem. Exporting raw coffee beans meant exporting profit. Foreign companies would buy these beans at low prices, process them abroad, and then sell the finished product at significantly higher margins. Uganda decided to change that. By prioritizing the export of processed goods over raw materials, the country is keeping more of the value chain within its own borders. This shift is already driving the growth of a local processing industry, creating jobs, boosting national revenue, and strengthening the overall economy. After all, why should Ugandan farmers do the hard work of growing coffee, only for the biggest profits to end up overseas? To support this transition, the government has been investing in local infrastructure, including coffee roasting and processing facilities, ensuring that more value is added before products leave the country. But this move is also shaking up the global coffee market. For years, international coffee companies relied on Uganda as a source of low-cost raw beans. Now they face a new reality. Either pay more for processed Ugandan coffee or look elsewhere for supply. That shift doesn't just affect pricing, it disrupts entire supply chains that were built on cheap African exports. By moving up the value chain, Uganda is strengthening its economic position, reducing reliance on unpredictable global commodity markets, and ensuring that more profits stay within the country, benefiting local workers and businesses. More importantly, this policy challenges a long-standing global assumption that African nations exist mainly to supply raw materials to more developed economies. Uganda is proving otherwise. By taking control of how its coffee is processed and sold, the country is stepping into the global market, not just as a supplier, but as a serious competitor. And in doing so, Uganda is redefining its place in the global economy. Still watching? Good, because what's coming next is even bigger. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a video like this. Now, back to it. 3. Gabon's log ban. In 2010, Gabon made a landmark decision by prohibiting the export of unprocessed timber, a move that fundamentally changed how the country managed its natural resources. Prior to this policy, Gabon's forestry sector was largely export-driven, sending raw logs to markets in Europe and Asia. Gabonese leadership recognized a troubling reality. The bulk of the profit generated from their own forests was ending up in foreign economies. Exporting unprocessed logs meant that other countries were doing the value-adding work and keeping the rewards. If Gabon's timber was lucrative enough to sustain industries abroad, why wasn't Gabon itself reaping those benefits? That central question drove the government's decision to halt raw log exports. The results were transformative. Domestic industries expanded rapidly, with furniture production, carpentry, and wood manufacturing all experiencing significant growth. New jobs were created, and Gabon's economy became more diversified and resilient, reducing its reliance on any single export commodity. The consequences for European timber buyers were equally notable. Companies that had long depended on affordable raw logs from Gabon were now forced to purchase processed wood products at higher prices. This disruption compelled many businesses to reassess their supply chains, and in doing so, confront just how much they had been undervaluing African resources. Gabon's approach quickly gained attention across the continent, offering a practical blueprint for other African nations exploring similar strategies. It proved that retaining raw materials for local processing is not just idealistic, it is economically viable and highly effective. Beyond the numbers, Gabon's log ban carries a clear message. African nations do not have to accept the role of low-value raw material suppliers. By investing in its own industries and prioritizing domestic growth over foreign convenience, Gabon has helped reshape the conversation about Africa's place in the global economy and shown that controlling your resources means controlling your future. 4. Niger's uranium restriction. In the wake of a recent change in government, Niger moved to place significant restrictions on uranium exports, with France bearing the most direct impact. For years, Niger's uranium had been a cornerstone of France's nuclear energy industry, sold under terms that overwhelmingly favored French interests while offering Niger comparatively little in return. The combination of rising global uranium prices and Niger's new export restrictions sent an unmistakable signal. Niger was done allowing its most valuable resource to be extracted at bargain rates for the benefit of foreign economies, while its own development stalled. And France's reaction to these restrictions revealed something telling. If French energy independence is as solid as long claimed, why did Niger's policy cause such immediate concern? The answer exposes a dependency that Europe has rarely been willing to openly acknowledge. France's nuclear sector, which generates the majority of the country's electricity, is now confronting higher costs and growing uncertainty over supply. But Niger's restrictions go well beyond economics. They represent a deliberate assertion of national sovereignty, a refusal to continue operating within a framework that was never built to serve Niger's interests. By taking control of its uranium trade, Niger is compelling European governments to come back to the table and renegotiate agreements that have long been skewed in the West's favor. Energy markets that were built on the assumption of cheap, readily available African resources are now facing a serious recalibration. France's vulnerability in this situation has brought a broader truth into sharp focus. African resources are not peripheral to Western prosperity, they are foundational to it. Niger's stance makes clear that African nations are no longer willing to be resource providers without fair and equitable compensation. This shift is quietly reordering the global energy landscape. What was once treated as a convenient supply arrangement is now being recognized for what it always was, a critical dependency. Niger has forced that reality into the open, and the reverberations are being felt far beyond Paris. 5. Guinea's food export ban. As food prices increased globally, Guinea made a decisive move, restricting the export of key staple crops, including rice, maize, and yams. For years, these agricultural products had been flowing out of the country, regularly leaving local markets undersupplied and exposing ordinary Guineans to the full force of international price volatility. The new policy signals a clear shift in priorities. Guinea's people come first. The question at the heart of this decision is a straightforward one. Why should Guineans face food shortages while their harvests are shipped to wealthier nations? This ban is not simply a crisis response. It reflects a deeper rethinking of how Guinea relates to its own agricultural wealth. By keeping a larger share of staple crops at home, Guinea is choosing domestic stability over the demands of foreign markets, shielding its population from the unpredictable swings of global food pricing. For Western companies that had grown accustomed to sourcing affordable agricultural goods from Africa, Guinea's policy is a significant disruption. Importers are now confronting higher prices and tighter supply, forced to either absorb the added costs or look elsewhere. The message is clear: Africa's resources are not an unlimited buffer for the rest of the world's consumption needs, particularly when drawing on them comes at a direct cost to African communities. Guinea's food export ban speaks to something larger than agriculture. It is a statement about self-reliance, about a nation choosing to treat its resources as a national asset rather than a commodity available to the highest foreign bidder. By insulating its domestic food supply from external pressures, Guinea is building resilience from the ground up. The precedent this sets is significant. Guinea is demonstrating to other African nations that reclaiming control over food systems is not only possible, it is a viable and principled path forward. In a world where food security is increasingly fragile, Guinea has chosen to secure its own foundation first. 6. Mozambique's timber ban. In 2017, Mozambique took a page from Gabon's playbook, prohibiting the export of unprocessed timber and requiring that all wood be processed within the country before it leaves its borders. The policy was driven by a clear ambition: to nurture homegrown industry, generate employment, and ensure that the wealth derived from Mozambique's forests stayed in Mozambique. For Western companies that had long relied on a steady supply of affordable raw timber from the country, the ban created an immediate obstacle. As Mozambique's domestic processing sector began to grow and mature, foreign buyers found their access to cheap, unfinished wood significantly curtailed. This raises an uncomfortable question for Western markets. If there is genuine commitment to Africa's economic development, why was the old arrangement, where Mozambique exported raw logs at low prices while high-value production happened elsewhere, considered acceptable for so long? Many foreign companies, it turns out, had little appetite for a model that actually benefited Mozambique. The low-cost, low-value supply chain suited them just fine. By bringing timber processing home, Mozambique is actively rejecting the subordinate role it was handed in the global economy. This is a country choosing to move up the value chain, to stop being the starting point of someone else's profit and become the author of its own economic story. The consequences for Western buyers are real: fewer options, higher prices, and the need to adapt. But from Mozambique's perspective, that is precisely the point. Its resources exist to build its future, not to subsidize the convenience of foreign markets. 7. Namibia's lithium restrictions. As the global race toward electric vehicles accelerated, so did the demand for lithium, and Namibia decided it would no longer watch that opportunity benefit everyone else. The government moved to restrict lithium exports with a deliberate goal: to build domestic processing capacity and secure Namibia's place in the booming green technology economy. The impact on Western tech giants and automotive manufacturers that had grown dependent on affordable lithium supplies was immediate. They now face a stark choice: invest directly in Namibia's local industry, or spend time and money searching for alternatives. Neither option is as comfortable as the old arrangement. The situation also exposes a glaring contradiction. Western governments and corporations have spent years championing sustainability, clean energy, and ethical supply chains. So why, when an African nation moves to take ownership of a resource that is central to that green transition, does the response look more like panic than applause? The scramble to find workarounds reveals that for many Western industries, sustainability was always easier to advocate for than to actually practice when it affected their bottom line. Namibia's restrictions have fundamentally altered the negotiating dynamic. Western companies accustomed to setting the terms are now being asked to come to the table on Namibia's conditions. That alone marks a significant shift in how African resource nations are choosing to engage with global markets. But beyond the economics, Namibia is staking out a broader position: that the benefits of the renewable energy revolution should not simply be extracted from African soil and enjoyed elsewhere. By retaining control over its lithium sector, Namibia is asserting that Africa deserves to be a genuine participant in the green economy, not merely its silent supplier. 8. Ivory Coast's cocoa control. As the world's single largest producer of cocoa, the Ivory Coast has made a bold move, restricting the export of raw cocoa beans in order to grow a homegrown chocolate industry. For years, the country watched as Western confectionery companies purchased its beans at low prices, processed them abroad, and sold the finished products at a substantial premium. The Ivory Coast supplied the foundation; others built the profit on top of it. The core question this policy raises is hard to dismiss. How is it that the country responsible for feeding the world's appetite for chocolate has remained on the periphery of the industry it sustains? By limiting raw exports, the Ivory Coast is directly challenging that imbalance, ensuring that more of the value generated from its cocoa stays within its own borders and translates into local jobs and industrial growth. For Western chocolate companies, the consequences are tangible. The era of inexpensive, readily available raw cocoa from Africa is giving way to a new reality, one defined by higher costs, tighter supply, and the need to fundamentally rethink how they source their most essential ingredient. But the significance of this policy stretches beyond market disruption. It is an assertion of economic dignity, a declaration that the Ivory Coast will no longer accept a supporting role in an industry it essentially makes possible. The country is not simply adjusting trade terms, it is demanding that the global chocolate industry reckon with how much it owes to African labor, African land, and African resources. This shift forces a long overdue reckoning, one that places the Ivory Coast where it rightfully belongs, not at the bottom of the supply chain, but as a central and empowered force within it. 9. Democratic Republic of the Congo. The DRC is home to some of the most significant reserves of copper and cobalt on Earth, two minerals that sit at the very core of modern technology, from consumer electronics to electric vehicles and renewable energy infrastructure. For decades, however, these resources left the country largely unprocessed, allowing Western corporations to pocket the substantial profits that come from refining and manufacturing, while the DRC received only a small portion of what its own resources were truly worth. That dynamic is now changing. The DRC has introduced export restrictions on raw copper and cobalt, actively pushing for domestic processing, so that more of the economic value generated by these minerals remains inside the country. The reasoning is difficult to argue against. Why should the DRC continue enabling the growth of foreign industries, while its own communities see little in return? By developing local refining capacity, the DRC stands to create meaningful employment, stimulate local economies, and finally capture the kind of value that has long flowed past its borders. For Western tech companies and automakers, the consequences are already being felt. Supply chains are becoming more complicated, costs are rising, and the era of sourcing cheap raw minerals from Central Africa without conditions is coming to an end. This goes beyond a shift in trade policy. The DRC is repositioning itself not as a passive source of raw materials, but as an active and consequential player in the global green economy. The broader message to Western corporations is unambiguous. Africa's resources are not available on unlimited, underpriced terms. The continent is now setting the conditions, and those conditions are centered on African development, African prosperity, and African sovereignty over African wealth. 10. Zimbabwe's chrome ban. Zimbabwe ranks among the world's leading producers of chrome, a mineral that is fundamental to industries ranging from stainless steel production to specialty chemicals. For years, raw chrome left the country at low prices, feeding foreign industries while Zimbabwe captured only a thin slice of the value its own ground produced. That calculus has now shifted. By banning the export of unprocessed chrome, Zimbabwe is making an unambiguous statement. The profits generated by its resources belong at home. The government has backed this policy with real investment, funding local smelting and processing facilities that are creating jobs and adding value to chrome before it ever reaches international markets. The question Zimbabwe's leadership is essentially posing to the world is a simple one. Why should the country remain a low-cost raw material provider when it has everything it needs to build a thriving domestic industry? For Western industries that had long depended on affordable Zimbabwean chrome, the ban has been disruptive. Companies are now navigating tighter supply, higher costs, and the uncomfortable task of rethinking supply chains they had taken for granted. Zimbabwe's move is part of a wider continental shift, as African nations increasingly refuse to accept the role the global economy has historically assigned them. Closing thoughts. Taken together, these 10 nations are doing something far more significant than adjusting export policy. They are collectively rewriting Africa's position in the global economy. For too long, the continent's vast natural wealth flowed outward, extracted cheaply, processed elsewhere, and returned to Africa as finished goods at a premium. That system enriched foreign economies, while keeping African nations locked out of the higher rungs of the value chain. These export restrictions are a direct challenge to that model. The conversation doesn't end here. It starts in the comments. What do you think? Will Western nations adapt and build fairer partnerships with Africa, or will they look for ways around it? Share your perspective below. And if this is the kind of content that matters to you, subscribe and join a growing community that refuses to look away.